Casting actors and actresses is a tricky matter. They can make or break a movie, and casting isn't exactly a science, it's an art. Sometimes you see something that no one else sees. Other times you only think you see it and you fall flat on your face. In this video, I want to take a look at movie castings that some people absolutely hated when they were announced. Sometimes after the performance, everyone came around. Other times they didn't, but all of these were interesting choices to begin with, and their performances are, for better and for worse, memorable. When Daniel Craig was chosen to play James Bond in Casino Royale, it was something of a departure from the typical Bond look. They were suave, dark-haired, and charming. Craig was a blonde known for his grittier and dramatic turns in movies like Layer Cake and Munich, and sort of broke the mold of what audiences had come to expect. But this was exactly the reaction that the producers wanted. Producer Barbara Broccoli and director Martin Campbell wanted to reinvent the franchise. The last Bond film before Craig took over, 2002's Die Another Day, while commercially successful, was too campy for some people, had some pretty bad CGI, and usually ranks lower on the list of people's favorite Bond films. It also came out around the same time as The Bourne Identity, which was a gritty spy action thriller. They wanted their next Bond to be more realistic, emotionally complex, and have an intense screen presence and take the character into a new era. Some people were not on board. For example, someone had set up a site, craignotbond.com. Upon the announcement, they wrote, quote, "Eon Productions angered fans around the world when they fired Pierce Brosnan at the height of his popularity as Bond. To add insult to injury, Eon cast a short, blonde, odd-looking Daniel Craig in the role of Bond. Craig, described by the New York Times as having a pale, flattened face and large, fleshy ears, is a terrible choice for Bond. If Eon Productions and Sony Pictures will not accept they've made a big mistake, then Bond fans promise to boycott Casino Royale," end quote. I had to re-record that a few times because I kept laughing at the description of Craig. The hate was wild though. Hell, the guy even got hate mail for taking on the role, and so did his mother. His predecessors were of the opposite opinion. Whether they felt this way for real, or whether it was just professional courtesy, Sean Connery, Roger Moore, Timothy Dalton, Pierce Brosnan, and eventually George Lazenby came out in support of Daniel Craig. He wasn't the only name in the mix, of course. Hugh Jackman, Clive Owen, Christian Bale, Carl Urban, and Henry Cavill were all in the mix, and director Martin Campbell said that it eventually came down to Cavill or Craig. But when Casino Royale came out, I think it's safe to say that it put most rumors to rest. Craig delved deep into Fleming's novels and created a more brutal, psychologically complex version of the character. He prepared by learning how to handle various weapons, nailing the fight choreography, and he developed a portrayal that emphasized Bond's capacity for violence and emotional vulnerability. The movie was a critical and commercial success, and he went on to have a long tenure as Bond. I'm curious to see who the next Bond will be and what Denis Villeneuve's interpretation looks like. When Tom Cruise was cast as the vampire Lestat in 1994's Interview with the Vampire, the decision immediately sparked controversy among fans of Anne Rice's beloved Vampire Chronicles series, as well as Anne Rice herself. Cruise had done movies like Top Gun, Rain Man, Born on the 4th of July, and Days of Thunder, and he was a proven box office draw. Fans were not pleased by the selection of Cruise, but, importantly, Anne Rice was not pleased. Janet Conant wrote an excellent article about the casting and its reaction for Esquire in March 1994 entitled "No Tom Cruise, an author and her fans attempt to sabotage a Hollywood vampire." In it, she recounts that one day Rice was traveling to a bookstore to promote a book. When they neared, she found that, quote, "gathered outside the bookstore nearly 1,000 sodden groupies, outfitted in galoshes and garbage bags, brandishing umbrellas and protest signs, were reciting the same litany at the top of their lungs. No Tom Cruise, no Tom Cruise, no Tom Cruise," end quote. The fans, at least a solid contingent of them, were not pleased by this casting. They felt that Cruise's all-American persona and relatively diminutive stature were wrong for the otherworldly Lestat. Fans viewed the casting as Hollywood's attempt to sanitize and commercialize their beloved dark fantasy. Many predicted that Cruise would turn the sophisticated vampire into just another action hero, destroying the character's literary complexity. Cruise was someone that Rice also felt she was saddled with. She had wanted Jeremy Irons or John Malkovich or Rutger Hauer, who she had modeled Lestat on. Anyone but Cruise. According to the Esquire article, quote, "spurred on by her readers, Rice has embarked on a one-woman crusade to embarrass Tom Cruise. Warner Brothers, the studio bankrolling the film, and David Geffen, the film's producer. To cheering crowds, Rice has been cursing Cruise for butchering her script, sanitizing the sexual content to accommodate his clean-cut image, and perpetrating the worst crime in the name of casting since the bonfire of the vanities," end quote. Cruise, for his part, approached the role with the intensity that he approaches all of his roles with. He immersed himself in Rice's books, trying to get a deeper understanding of the character. He perfected the look and the accent, giving himself over to him. When the movie came out, it made bank at the box office and got decent reviews. Cruise got plenty of praise, with the New York Times' Janet Maslin writing that he was, quote, flabbergastingly right for this role, end quote. It even managed to turn Rice around, who personally apologized to Cruise and said that he was right for it. Cruise ended up proving everybody, especially the fans, wrong. When Christopher Nolan announced that Heath Ledger would be playing the Joker in The Dark Knight, the decision raised eyebrows across Hollywood and among Batman fans. Ledger was primarily known for his romantic roles in films like 10 Things I Hate About You and A Knight's Tale, with his most serious dramatic work being Brokeback Mountain and Monsters Ball. The casting seemed like a dramatic departure from the character's previous cinematic incarnation by Jack Nicholson, and people questioned whether Ledger had the gravitas and menace necessary to portray Batman's most iconic villain. The fan reaction was swift and largely negative, with online forums and entertainment websites flooded with criticism and skepticism. They thought that Ledger was too young, too pretty, and too associated with teen romantic comedies to pull off the role. Nicholson at least had a hell of a resume and had already played some iconic crazy characters. Ledger had none of that. However, Ledger threw himself into the role with an intensity that would become legendary. He locked himself in a hotel room for weeks, developing the character's distinctive voice, laugh, and mannerisms, while keeping a diary written from the Joker's perspective. He studied the comic books, drawing inspiration from various incarnations of the character, while creating something entirely new. His preparation included experimenting with different makeup looks and developing the character's unsettling physical tics and psychological profile, often staying in character between takes to maintain the Joker's disturbing energy. Others would try to emulate this method approach with unfortunate results, to say the least. When The Dark Knight was released, everyone was unanimous in the praise for Ledger's performance. It was a masterclass in method acting, and he created a Joker that was terrifying, unpredictable, and wickedly charismatic. It's probably the gold standard for comic book villains, if not antagonists, writ large. Tragically, Ledger's accidental death from an overdose before the film's release added something of a mystical layer over the performance. The portrayal earned him a posthumous Academy Award win for Best Supporting Actor. The performance proved that unconventional casting choices could yield wonderful results when supported by serious commitment and artistic vision. Ledger had both of those in spades. When Robert Downey Jr. was cast as Tony Stark for 2008's Iron Man, there were three kinds of reactions. First, there was the reaction from Marvel leadership, particularly Kevin Feige and Jon Favreau. They were ecstatic about Downey, with Favreau saying, quote, "The best and worst moments of Robert's life have been in the public eye. He had to find an inner balance to overcome obstacles that went far beyond his career. That's Tony Stark," end quote. Then there was the reaction from other parts of the studio. They were pretty sour on it in the beginning. Downey's career had been derailed by well-publicized struggles with substance abuse, multiple arrests, and erratic behavior that had made him virtually uninsurable for major studio productions. Many viewed him as a risky choice for launching what would become the Marvel Cinematic Universe, especially since Iron Man was considered a relatively minor character compared to more popular heroes like Spider-Man and the X-Men. The casting seemed like a gamble that could either revitalize Downey's career or sink Marvel's ambitious plans for a shared superhero universe. And third, there was the fans. Here it was divided. We might not think it now, but his troubles were pretty well publicized back in the late 90s and early aughts. Most agreed that he was a talented actor, but would his past demons come back to haunt him? Would he end up being a liability instead of an asset? It was fair skepticism, compounded by the fact that Iron Man wasn't a household name like Batman or Superman, making the success of both the character and actor even more uncertain. Downey was able to draw on his own experiences with addiction and redemption, finding parallels between his personal journey and Tony Stark's character arc. Stark is not an alcoholic in the MCU, but the first movie is all about him redeeming himself. He was able to improvise some of the dialogue, which, coupled with his personal charisma, worked well in developing his arrogance and wit. Iron Man transformed both Downey's life and the superhero genre. Critics and audiences give it rave reviews, and his performance helped elevate what could have been a bog-standard superhero origin into something interesting. The movie was a massive commercial hit and helped vindicate the massive risk that Marvel took in making it. If it flopped, that would have been it for the company. Instead, Iron Man became the cornerstone of their movies for a decade, and RDJ became the world's highest paid actor for several years. When Anne Hathaway was cast as Selina Kyle and Catwoman in Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight Rises, there was some skepticism from fans. Hathaway, a solid actress, was known for her roles in movies like The Princess Diaries and The Devil Wears Prada. It was an unconventional choice, to say the least. Many fans had hoped for a more traditionally sultry actress in the mold of Michelle Pfeiffer's iconic portrayal, and Hathaway's wholesome image appeared to clash with Catwoman's seductive and morally ambiguous nature. They were not disabused of that notion when the first pictures were released. In a Hollywood Reporter article, Philiana Ng wrote that, quote, "Last week, the first image of Hathaway as Selina Kyle in the upcoming The Dark Knight Rises was released on the web, and many did not have a favorable impression. Holly Duffy said, 'I'm sure it won't be as bad as I think, but still, Catwoman doesn't look like that, and Anne Hathaway is too cuddly to play her,' end quote." The Atlantic, meanwhile, reported the same, with Sadie Doyle writing that, quote, "Though some greeted the news with excitement, many fans argued that casting Hathaway was a fatal choice. She was too sweet for the role, they said. She wasn't serious enough, she didn't have enough edge," end quote. That certainly seemed to be the prevailing opinion. Hathaway devoted herself to the role with a fervor, though. She trained in various martial arts and adopted a rigorous fitness regimen to achieve Catwoman's athletic physique. She even said that despite feeling fit, this was the most physically demanding role that she'd had up until that point, and it forced her to redouble her training efforts. She studied the character, as well as the woman that the character was based on, Golden Age film actress Hedy Lamarr. She practiced her character's distinctive voice and mannerisms, developing a portrayal that emphasized the character's intelligence and survival instincts over just the sex appeal. On release, Hathaway's performance got positive reviews. Critics praised the complexity she brought to the role while maintaining Catwoman's allure. She successfully balanced the character's criminal nature with her heroic potential, crafting a Catwoman who felt both dangerous and sympathetic. It certainly demonstrated Hathaway's range and her ability to take on action roles. Now, most of the roles I've talked about so far, people came around to, but not everyone is so lucky. When John Wayne lobbied for and was cast as Genghis Khan in 1956's The Conqueror, it was probably one of the most tone-deaf casting choices in American film history. Wayne, the epitome of the American cowboy on screen, was chosen to portray the 13th century Mongol emperor in what producer Howard Hughes envisioned as an epic historical drama. It was an amusing decision, to say the least. This was John Wayne at the peak of his stardom. The guy could have done anything, and for some reason he really wanted to play Genghis Khan. Now, the concept of fan backlash as we know it today did not exist back then. Still, people noticed that this was an inherently silly casting. Variety, in what counts as a positive review, wrote, quote, "The marquee value of the John Wayne-Susan Howard teaming more than offsets any incongruity of the casting," end quote. The Monthly Film Bulletin, now part of Sight and Sound, wrote that, quote, "The weakly contrived narrative is singularly lacking in dramatic tension, and it is difficult to see this Temujin, for all his high-flown cries to heaven to support his destiny, as a potential world-beater or as even an amiable bandit. He is merely John Wayne struggling with an unfortunate piece of casting and with such embarrassingly silly lines as, 'I feel this Tartar woman is for me,' end quote." And A.H. Waller, writing for the New York Times, said that it was unintentionally hilarious. "I'm sure that Wayne approached the role professionally, but his attempt at acting as Genghis Khan was unconvincing at best. He didn't have access to the kind of research or scholarship that we have now that could have guided him to a better performance, though even then it would be difficult to see anyone but John Wayne on the screen." The movie was a critical disaster and a commercial disappointment. Most reviews would focus their criticism on his unmistakable American drawl, the amusing one-liners, and the overall terrible acting, which made for more unintentional comedy than anything. Beyond that, though, the film also gained a tragic notoriety when many of the cast and crew members, including Wayne himself, later developed cancer, possibly due to radiation exposure from atomic testing near the filming location, adding another layer of infamy to what was already considered one of Hollywood's worst casting decisions. But that's for a different video. 1999's The World Is Not Enough was the 19th James Bond film and starred Pierce Brosnan in his third outing as the character. It had a plot that involved oil pipelines, nuclear weapons, and a villain that's immune to pain. Denise Richards was cast as Dr. Christmas Jones, a nuclear physicist who becomes Bond's ally and romantic interest. Richards had started off as a model and at the time was known for her roles in Starship Troopers and Wild Things. She was a rising star and seemed like she would fit the mold as a Bond girl, but the role required her to portray a brilliant scientist with an expertise in nuclear physics. This, for a broad swath of the population, she was unable to do adequately. Her performance was ridiculed for the lack of credibility. Her delivery of the dialogue was wooden, and she made it impossible for people to believe that she was portraying a genius. To be sure, she wasn't hired because she was an actual nuclear physicist. It's called acting for a reason, after all. but that does necessitate doing some research into the kind of role that you're portraying. Some actors even become experts, such as Tom Cruise becoming a pilot or Daniel Day-Lewis actually being able to paint with his feet thanks to his prep for My Left Foot. Charles Taylor, writing for Salon, writes that, quote, Richards has to stand around trying to muster some authority while snapping off her lines and sounding more like a high school kid in a snit, end quote. Nathan Rabin, writing for the AV Club, says, quote, Richards plays a nuclear physicist this time out, but you don't need to be one yourself to realize that her skimpily attired character seems a lot more like a San Diego aerobics instructor than a scientist, end quote. And Peter DeBruge, writing for Variety, called her, quote, the least plausible nuclear physicist in the history of movies, end quote. To be fair, it's not entirely Richards' fault. The producers prioritized physical attractiveness over acting or character authenticity, and whatever we can say about her character, it's undeniable that Richards is very attractive. And she's not even necessarily a bad actress. While Starship Troopers and Wild Things are campy movies, they do play to her strengths. This role didn't, and I'm not sure that it'll be reappraised anytime soon. 2012 Snow White and the Huntsman, directed by Rupert Sanders, was a darker, action-oriented reimagining of the classic fairy tale, designed, no doubt, to capitalize on the darker reinterpretation of 2010's Alice in Wonderland, which became a sleeper billion-dollar hit. Seriously, of all the movies that could have hit $1 billion, I don't think I would have expected Alice in Wonderland to do it. The movie had elaborate battle sequences, dark magic, and a more mature tone. They cast Charlize Theron as the evil queen obsessed with youth and beauty, while reimagining Snow White as a warrior princess capable of leading armies against her stepmother's forces. Kristen Stewart was cast as Snow White, coming off her massive success in the Twilight franchise. The series established her as one of Hollywood's most bankable stars, alongside Robert Pattinson and, for a while, Taylor Lautner. The role required her to transform from an innocent princess into a warrior leader, conveying vulnerability and strength while serving as the inspirational figure around which the resistance to the evil queen would rally. Now, I do enjoy Kristen Stewart as an actress. She's got some great roles, including the Twilight series, but also Adventureland, Certain Women, and The Runaways. But this was a miscast. Her performance was widely criticized for her lack of emotional range and her inability to convincingly portray Snow White's supposed inspirational qualities. The monotone delivery and limited facial expressions made it impossible to believe that she could inspire loyalty or lead armies in a battle. Lisa Kennedy at the Denver Post captured it well, quote, we can almost glean Snow White's heroic possibilities through his clouded eyes. As much as we'd like to, we certainly can't from Stewart's efforts, end quote. Her performance lacked the warmth, charisma, and strength necessary to make Snow White a compelling protagonist, instead making her seem perpetually confused and disinterested in her own story. It was not a performance that would rouse people to rebellion. Rather, it would probably convince them that the realm was doomed and that it was time to get the hell out of Dodge. Stewart isn't a bad actress by any means, but she was wildly miscast in this role. It might strike some as odd that I include Johnny Depp's performance as Jack Sparrow here. After all, it's a widely held performance now, one of those where the guy seems irreplaceable as the character that he portrayed. But when they were casting Parts of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl, the casting of Depp raised questions from two segments, the executives at Disney and people in the industry. Audiences were probably more interested than not, if only because this was Disney's attempt at turning one of its most famous Disneyland rides into a blockbuster epic. First, the industry reaction. People were, apparently, flabbergasted that Depp was in contention at all. At that point, he'd been known for doing artsy films that people would praise, but not ones that would necessarily amplify his bank account. I was reading a 20-year-old Newsweek article from the time when Newsweek was actually good and a reputable source and came across this passage, quote, when news hit years ago that Depp was going to make the first Pirates, the buzz around town was that he must be broke and that after years of taking the artistic high road, he had finally sold out, end quote. But even more so, there was skepticism around the idea of doing a pirate movie at all. First, there was the whole it's based off of a ride thing. But moreover, pirate movies were famous for being big flops. Movies set on the water, unless they were called Titanic and were directed by James Cameron, tended to cost a lot, stress out everybody involved, and offered little return on investment. Sure, there were plenty of swashbuckling films throughout the golden age of Hollywood, but then 1995's Cutthroat Island put them on ice for almost a decade. When Disney did finally decide to do it, Jerry Bruckheimer thought that Depp was the right fit. They needed someone that could counter Disney's reputation for kids' fare, and Depp was edgy enough for that. They eventually agreed, but began to regret it almost immediately. The studio had expected a more traditional action hero in the mold of Errol Flynn's classic pirate films, but Depp had other ideas for bringing the character to life. His vision for Jack Sparrow drew inspiration from Keith Richards and mixed it with Golden Age pirates. Disney executives were reportedly horrified when they first saw Depp's portrayal during early screenings. His speech as Jack was slurred enough that they were wondering whether or not he was drunk. It was to the point that they considered adding subtitles to his scenes. In Depp's words, quote, "I think it was Michael Eisner, the head of Disney at the time, who was quoted as saying he's ruining the movie," end quote. They wondered if the flamboyant, effeminate interpretation would work for their intended family audience. Turns out there was nothing to worry about. Depp's commitment to the role, to developing the distinctive swagger, speech patterns, and unpredictable behavior, despite studio pressures to conform to more traditional expectations, is, in part, what made him the right fit for the role. After all, that's how a pirate should act. He didn't tone it down, banking on the fact that his portrayal would make the character memorable, and he was right about that. The critical and commercial success vindicated Depp's creative choices entirely. Audiences and critics singled him out for praise, and he's been the highlight of the films, even 4 and 5, which left much to be desired otherwise. It was so good that he earned a Best Actor nomination at the 76th Academy Awards. He turned what could have been a generic role into an iconic one. Casting isn't easy. I know that as fans, we'd like to think that we know the perfect person for a role and that the movie would be saved if only they would be cast. Alas, I'm not sure how often that would be the case. Heath Ledger, Daniel Craig, and Tom Cruise were all departures from what one might expect for the roles they played. Meanwhile, it might seem obvious that Denise Richards or Kristen Stewart or John Wayne were the worst for their roles, but you can never really know until the performance is committed, and by then it's too late to change direction.